Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are talking about Beastmen. Imperial Beastmen. For the fluffy, horned savages are not exclusively a product of Warhammer fantasy. They do indeed have an equivalent version of themselves in the far-flung future of the 41st millennium as well. Although their precise status in the lore is somewhat debatable, as we've got to go way back to the second edition of Warhammer 40,000, practically Rogue Trader, to find firm lore mentions of Beastmen. And their story has evolved very little since, with the only other real solid recent mentions being 30k and Necromunda rather than technically 40k. So their status is a little debatable, but I think there is more than enough of a firm basis to consider them to still be properly canon. Plus, I just like the idea of Beastmen serving the Emperor. And hey, we've already got canonical cat girls, so why not goat girls as well? We should probably start then by figuring out what exactly a Beastman is and what we're talking about here, because there have been a couple of different variations. Now, I'm sure most of you who are familiar with Warhammer Fantasy have already got a pretty solid idea of what we're looking at here. A Beastman, generally speaking, is a human, or at least that is one of the prevailing theories, with clear and prevailing bestial features. The most commonly appealed to example of a beast man resembles a goat, with a pronounced snout and a pair of horns extending from the head. The exact placement of these horns are not consistent. Sometimes they are coming from the forward portions of the head. Sometimes they are growing directly out of the sides of the head. Sometimes they're angled forward. Sometimes they're angled backwards. And indeed, there are even cases of beastmen with multiple horns as well. Although this is usually seen as a sign of a more extensive mutation. And we'll return to the topic of mutation a bit later, as it isn't necessarily the correct term to use here. Beyond the facial features, many beastmen also sport an increase in hair covering the body, perhaps a shaggy mane or a far more extensive beard than you'd see on most Homo sapiens. Some also sport fur on their body, such as the chest or upper legs. Some also features cloven hooves or very large hands, sometimes even with claws. They also tend to be rather massive and muscular creatures as well. If they were able to stand up straight, or are able, as many beastmen suffer from a hunched posture, they would probably stand at least as tall of a man, and probably taller still, and a fair bit broader. But, whilst this is the most commonly referred to example of Homo sapiens variatus, it is, as the name suggests, not by any stretch of the imagination the only one. Indeed, the term beast man could potentially and theoretically refer to any human-like creature with prevailing bestial features, meaning that it could just as easily refer to an individual that has predominantly equine features, or a bovine look, or even that of a great cat, or porcine. The goat-like appearance appears to be the most usual, the most normal, quote-unquote, but theoretically the term beastman could be applied to any of the preceding examples, and potentially others as well. But there is a very, very large qualifying statement attached to this. The Beastmen in question need to be a stable mutation within a certain very small tolerance level of that of the baseline human form. So if we've got a planet filled to the brim with cow men, for example, they do need to all be cow men. If a cow beastman gives birth to a horse beastman, that would be a abomination. That would be a mutation to be burned as swiftly as possible. Which might sound ridiculous. I mean, if we're already accepting an entire sub-race, species, whatever you wish to call it, of people that look like cows, surely if one pops out looking like a horse, that is within expected tolerances, right? Not at all. As the Beastmen's classification as abhumans is dependent upon them being a stable mutation. So we've talked about abhumans to some extent previously, but to quickly reiterate, an abhuman is a human that has simply mutated in a stable strain that is constantly reproducible and can reproduce with itself and potentially other humans, due usually to some environmental factors. The Ogrins, for example, are a strain of abhumans. We recognize them as humans. They are the Homo sapiens gigantus, and they therefore have, by and large, the same rights as other human citizens. These rights, by the way, boil down to paying taxes and joining the army. But hey, it also means that they're protected from, just being killed, so there are some benefits as well. And whilst the Ogrin is an example of a fairly major deviation from the human form, there are others like the Homo sapiens tenebris, who are humans that evolved in a pitch-black environment, deep within a planet's crust, or an asteroid, for example, until eventually, over countless generations of stable mutations, the humans' eyes became vestigial organs, and eventually simply disappeared altogether because, well, they were pointless. They weren't needed any longer. But even if they lack eyes, they're still humans, they still look human, and they are still genetically similar enough to humans to the point where they are considered basically human. Whereas the abhuman qualifier basically then comes in to explain that there is something unusual about them. Now, Beastmen are probably on the far more extreme ends of this classification, as they look really goddamn disturbing. And in 9 cases out of 10, if an Imperial expeditionary force happened across an unexplored planet, and it happened to be populated by Beastmen, odds are pretty good they'd just glass it from orbit and call it a Xenos civilization scratched out. This amount of prejudice is made significantly worse as well by the fact that there are a lot of Beastmen serving the arch-enemy too, but we'll get to that a little bit later. However, crucially, the Beastmen do appear to indeed be a stable strain of mutant, just like Nightsiders, like Ogrins, like Longshanks, etc. However, there is still some debate, and this debate's been going on for the last 10,000 odd years, as to whether or not Beastmen are indeed a stable genetic deviation of the basic human form, or if they have been warped into this form by an external force. That external force most likely being either chaos or some sort of long lost and long forgotten large-scale genetic experiment. Now, this is an important distinction, mind you, as there have indeed been entirely genetically manufactured strains of abhumans before, like the ethereal strain, for example, that we've talked about previously. These are also considered to be humans, even if they are, in essence, completely artificial. So it doesn't have to be a natural deviation from the human form, it just needs to be stable. Whereas the second option, them being created by the warping influence of chaos, well, that's obviously a hell of a lot worse. If it could ever be proven without the shadow of a doubt, or even within roughly reasonable doubt, that the Beastmen were a freak, stable warp mutation, well, to put it like this, the Beastmen population across the Imperium would be very lucky indeed if they were merely reduced to a permanent servile status and castrated en masse. As for which one is correct, well, we don't know. As for them being a genetic experiment, well, during the golden age of technology, humanity was up to all sorts of crazy stuff. And even more crazy stuff during the long night as well. So it's entirely possible that they were a manufactured species. It is also equally possible that they could be a stable genetic deviation from the baseline human form, one created to increase virility, aggression, and strength, which during the long night would seem sensible mutations to be sure. And it's also equally possible that they could be some form of chaos warped mutation. Now, usually chaos does not mutate in quite such a predictable form, but by its very nature, chaos is everything and anything, including contradictions to itself. Though it should also be pointed out that there are a significant number, a very large number, of loyal Beastmen, and surely if they were an active chaos mutation, you'd think there'd be some sort of trigger hidden deep within them that would make them more susceptible to the dark gods, right? Well, therein of course lies the question as to whether or not they are truly loyal. Let us begin then with the Imperial Beastmen in the Imperial Army. That's right, the army, not the guard. As the first time we know of significant large-scale mass recruitment of Homo sapiens variatus was during the early years of the Great Crusade. As the Imperium stretched its influence across more and more of the galaxy, it swiftly became clear that it was going to need a hell of a lot more men to garrison all of this, and to continue conquering new planets. The Legiones Astartes could certainly be the tip of the spear, but they would be utterly wasted sitting around twiddling their thumbs while suppressing a handful of goat herders on some backwater savage world. Furthermore, the explorator fleets were far better used in wide-roaming spearheads, rather than as massed broad formations intended to cover vast areas of space. The Imperial Army, therefore, was created as an auxiliary support formation to the Legiones. They would follow in the Astartes' footsteps, supporting them directly when required, and taking over the more onerous duties of occupation when required as well. It swiftly became clear, however, that Terra alone and the solar system was nowhere even remotely capable of providing the number of soldiers required. Therefore, recruitment was extended to compliant worlds. Initially, this would have been extended sparingly, of course, only to planets who had shown an eager willingness to serve the Imperial cause. But as, yet again, that turned out to be nowhere near enough dudes either, the requirements were slowly but surely slackened again and again and again and again and again and again and again, until the literal goat people were donning the uniforms of the Imperial Army. Now, it swiftly became apparent that Beastmen were not necessarily suited to extended garrison deployment either. One, because, I mean, look at them, and two, it's not just external visuals that make them Beastmen. Beastmen also tend to be significantly less intelligent than your average human being, and a lot more aggressive, too. This would have precluded them from the duties of the Imperial army initially, but again, as the Legioni Statis ranged ever further afield, and the enormous gulfs of empty space grew vaster and vaster still, more and more of the burden of pushing the Crusade forwards fell upon the shoulders of the Imperial army, who saw ready use for a bunch of hyper-aggressive, muscled-up maniac beastmen who were possessed of just barely enough of a rudimentary intelligence to understand the order of charge that thing and kill it, please. One could make a rather convincing argument that they were indeed the perfect soldiers, although usually in need of a little bit of external guidance to really get the best out of them. There were even programs put in place to try to achieve just this, with Beastmen regiments either being permanently attached to other Imperial army formations, or even being commanded by human officers, or being commanded by members of their own species that proved more erudite than the rest. Then, of course, came that whole kerfuffle with Horus, which did a number on basically everything. But even after the Emperor's ascendancy to the Golden Throne and the full-bore entrance of the Imperial cult, Beastmen continued to serve in the various armies of the new Imperium, continuing to remain loyal and steadfast soldiers. Although the way in which they were recruited tended to change somewhat. Back in the day, when the Imperial army was bringing them together, it would no doubt have used simplistic terms like honor, loyalty, strength, going out into the galaxy to challenge yourself and earn a living by fighting, things like that, you know? Whereas the Imperial cult tends to use slightly different, persuasive tactics. One of the most frequently used against both the Beastmen and many Abhumans was to play to their lower intelligence by explaining to them that the God Emperor was, well, literally a god, as in a primitive god of infinite power who could smite them at any moment should they prove disloyal, and they were fundamentally twisted, deranged, damaged, perhaps due to some great eternal sin, and long gone in the past. Beastmen, you see, were filthy, dirty, twisted. They were the descendants of sinners, left mutated in this new corporeal form. However, fear not, noble Beastmen, because if you sign up to join the Imperial Guard and get killed in his glorious service, your soul will be redeemed. You will go on to the afterlife as a full and complete human, as a pure and beautiful soul purged of all of the vicious filth and dirt of your living flesh. Pretty persuasive argument if you're talking to a goat with the intelligence of a 5-year-old child. Made all the more persuasive if the Beastman in question has been continuously hounded and persecuted by Imperial society up until that point, as this is an opportunity to get away from all of that and gain the God Emperor's forgiveness. Although, I will hasten to point out as well, not all Beastmen, #. See, again, Beastmen are technically human. This technicality is enforced somewhat haphazardly, as there will undoubtedly be worlds out there where the majority of the population are Beastmen, in which case they probably won't have a whole lot of reason to, oppress one another, but these worlds are likely to be very primitive, probably tribalistic societies, as the Beastmen are not, again, excessively clever. So they'd be more likely to be death worlds, or jungle worlds, or savage planets, or feudal worlds, or perhaps even just vast planet governed over by a handful of humans who steer the various Beastmen tribes in, well, whatever way their local fetishes steer them. But on other planets, where the Beastmen are a portion of, mixed into the general populace of regular humans, in most cases they are probably going to be treated very, 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 very poorly. Because again, they are really ugly, and they kind of look like demons. So, in a hyper-religious society like the Imperium of Man, and a stridently xenophobic one as well, yeah, the dude that looks like a two-legged goat is going to get quite a bit of shit walking down the street. But they are still going to usually be integrated into wider society on the same level as the rest of the populace. It's just that, well, their crime rate is going to be significantly higher most of the time, often due to them being the victims of aforementioned crime. Whereas on other planets, they may also be viewed as subservient creatures, either straight out enslaved or viewed as second or third class citizens, whose only real rights and privileges are, most of the time, not being killed on sight by Imperial law enforcement. There are even indeed ongoing moves within the Imperium from certain members of the Inquisition, for example, and even within the ranks of the Ministorum and Administratum to permanently reduce the status of Beastmen from abhumans to straight-up mutants, which would, in all due likelihood, end with a mass genocide of the poor little Beastmen. But up until that time, they are still allowed into the Imperial army in most cases, although there are absolutely going to be exceptions to that rule as well, often dependent upon precisely how bestial they are, as there are going to be Beastmen who, by and large, look human, except they have perhaps a snout, or they have perhaps a pair of horns. These would be easier to overlook, shall we say, for the Imperial recruitment officer. Now, obviously, Beastmen would never be mixed into regular Imperial Guard regiments, or, well, I say never, but considering the sheer size of the Imperium, there's probably at least one mixed regiment out there somewhere. But normally, they would either be recruited into specific Imperial Guard regiments, or more usually, they would become members of the Militarum Auxilia. This means that they would be considered as abhuman Imperial Guard regiments, and employed in much the same way that Ogrins might, for example, where instead of being expected to organize and fight as a complete whole, they are instead lent out to various other regiments, becoming detachments and, well, again, auxilia, although unlike the Ogrins, who require human leadership, or the Rattlings, which would make really bad fighters all on their own, the Beastmen can theoretically operate independently as a regular regiment. Although, well, see, there's some complications to both sides of this. As we've discussed ad infinitum at this point, regular humans are not very fond of the Goat Man, and thus having a regiment of Beastmen operating alongside an Imperial Guard regiment, well, it's likely to see a significant uptick in friendly fire incidents up and down the front line. Having them operate directly within a regiment as militarum auxilia, well, depending upon how used to the regiment is to Abhumans, that could either go fairly well or be an absolute disaster. Imagine being the average Imperial guardsman, and your officer comes along and says, "Right, we've got some specialists along with us today, special attackers ready to charge the enemy's trenches," and you get all excited, expecting to see a bunch of tempestuous stormtroopers or something. Instead, you're presented to 24 half-naked, two-legged goat people that stink to high heaven and communicate primarily by baying at one another, armed with a wide variety of projectile weapons, the occasional las gun, some auto guns, and sticks, stones, and cudgels. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, they remain excellent shock troopers. Their brawn, their sheer size, their toughness make them fantastic assaulters, and their below-average intelligence means that they're not going to look out over the pockmarked no man's land and think to themselves, "Boy, there must be a lot of artillery over there." And equipped with Imperial Guard weaponry, things like Vox casters, personal Vox beads, las guns, flak armor, potentially specialized weaponry like flamethrowers or plasma weapons, well, they are going to be a pretty goddamn good fighting force. But if they can presumably be, taught to operate these weapons, that is, and if not, swords and cudgels will do just fine as well. However, due to the widespread bigotry against their kind across the Imperium, they also do tend to show up quite often on the enemy side too, as the Chaos Gods seem quite fond of Beastmen, even having created their own dedicated servants. We've got Pestigors, we've got Zarngors, we've got Blood Gors, and so on, all of which are very clearly chaotic creatures. Now again, there's also Chaos Humans, so this doesn't necessarily mean anything, and if you live within a society that actively hates and is disgusted at every part of you, well, you can't really be too surprised when a significant portion of that repressed population decides they're going to go looking for a master that appreciates them a bit more. And Beastmen do seem to be a pinch more favored, often by the Chaos Gods, than the average human, which is an interesting little factoid because it could mean two things. It could mean that the Beastmen are inherently chaotic creatures, and therefore, when they return to their gods, they lavish gifts upon them, or that they are more susceptible to the mutating touch of chaos. However, it could also mean the exact opposite. See, the Chaos Gods tend to favor those who seek them out despite their position and their natural tendencies. A Chaos God grants his gifts and blessings utterly arbitrarily, most of the time, of course, but they tend to favor upstarts, shall we say. A Chaos Marauder that has lived his entire life on a chaos-infested planet, who has worshipped the gods from the earliest moment he could pass breath over his lips, is, well, already a devotee. Who gives a shit about him? He's never had to choose to be a chaos worshipper. He was one from the beginning. If anything, it'd be more impressive if he became a loyalist. But a loyal Imperial citizen who was not born with chaos in his heart, who nevertheless chooses chaos, even though there are going to be a great deal of hardships involved in doing so, escaping his planets, avoiding persecution, avoiding witch hunters, the Inquisition, etc. Well, that is a far more valuable servant to the Chaos Gods by far. And so the Beastmen's increased how do we put it? Affinity for chaos gifts could in fact be, theoretically, a sign that they are amongst the more loyal of the Imperium's servants. That is, of course, again, pure speculation, but one could certainly make the argument, and with the Imperium now moving steadily towards reducing Beastmen to nothing more than simple chaos mutants with no rights whatsoever, because they fear the mutants becoming unruly monsters of chaos, we might have a little bit of a good old-fashioned self-fulfilling prophecy on our hands, mightn't we? As if there is no place for the Beastmen within human society, within Imperial society. Well, as I've said so many times in defense of the Imperium, there is no virtue in allowing one species to go extinct. And now you know a bit more about Beastmen in 40k, and loyal Beastmen as well. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.